There's a person from Nepal that follows us, and he's such a good guy. His name's Ashwin, and he does his best at typing in English because he knows so much more English than I could ever speak of his language. But he is asking just simply, can you walk us back? Why is drug addiction, do you think, despite mounds of evidence, why is it defined as an incurable disease? And he wants to know if there's any tips to either making sense of it or helping others make sense of this.
Well, you and I, from the United States, and there's a temperance tradition. America invented the disease theory of addiction around the turn of the century. A medical doctor who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, Benjamin Rush, defined addiction as a disease, alcoholism as a disease. And it didn't take off right away. But in the 19th century, that idea became prevalent in the United States. By the way, for him, only spirits created the disease. Wine and punch and cider didn't. So there were variations on that. And then in the temperance movement just took over in America as part of a fundamental Protestantism, which doesn't exist everywhere. America is in a remarkably religious country. And ironically, it became more so in the 19th century. The founders of the United States of America never mentioned the word Jesus Christ. They talked about religion in deistic terms, like there's some greater power. It's almost more like Buddhism than it is Christianity. But 19th century America turned back in a very basic way to fundamental Protestantism. And along with it came temperance and the idea that that was a marching pathway to hell. And once you started drinking, you went down that path and it was irreversible. I have a 8-panel picture on my wall that describes a guy who started drinking a little bit of wine and he ends up in an insane asylum. And his daughter's a prostitute and he's murdered his wife. And that was the version that was cast out. And it eventually culminated in the United States, maybe not in Nepal, no other Western country. We had prohibition. Alcohol was illegal to be bought and sold and consumed publicly from 1920 to 1933. It's a little hard to imagine. And then we decided, well, let's not do that. And one reason we decided let's not do that was when the Depression came, a certain amount of people said, harm reduction wise, it's nice to have a drink.
Yeah.
Of course, people were drinking all along in the 20s, and there were terrible results. Of course, Italian people made wine in their bathtubs, but other people were drinking all kinds of non-drinkable alcohol. And people decided economically, medically, and criminally, of course, there was Al Capone, this prohibition thing wasn't working. They called it the Great Experiment. And what they went from temperance, which was alcohol led you to hell, to AA. Prohibition ceased in 1933. AA was created in 35 and the big book was written in 39. It transformed temperance to the idea that only an alcoholic was a person who drank and went in an irreversible path to hell, and they had to abstain forever because they were an alcoholic per se. And so we have a temperance tradition thinking of this drug and alcohol use as a disease is steeped into our very souls in America. I don't know how you escaped it. I'm Jewish. Jews never quite got the whole temperance thing. The Jews as a group, I mean, they're not Christians for starters. They don't believe that you can turn to God and that he saves you. That's not a Jewish way of thinking. And Jews have a ceremony called a bris when a baby is circumcised. The first prayer they say to the baby is a prayer for wine, and they put wine on his lips, which is a good way to go if you're being circumcised. So Jews have a hard time getting with temperance mentality. Some have managed it over. I mean, Gabor Mate is Jewish. He's not temperance, but he sort of goes along with AA. So he's learned to try and go that way, but it's not a natural way of thinking. And so I'm an example on an awful lot of prominent people in the non-disease addiction field come from a Jewish background. Ethan Nadelman, with the Drug Policy Alliance, Carol Tavris, other people. And so I've always looked at this in a way and saying, what are they talking about? And I've developed a different point of view. My point of view is not different. It's very Southern European. I think so. When I meet Greek people, of course, Greek people have been very prominent in my life, or Italian people, and French have a sense of alcohol much more like Jewish people's. So they're different worldviews. But America, and some Northern European Protestant countries are so steeped in temperance and the disease theory is a natural segue from that it's just bred into their lifeblood.
What a good answer. So I guess it's, as Ashwin is sort of trying to figure out right now, he's right in thinking that it's a really bizarre story that we've created to fit.
And we've imposed it on other parts of the world.
Right.
It's common. Well, people. Somebody told me a story where their daughter was big in AA, and she went to Russia, and they had group meetings, AA meetings, and they began the meeting with a shot of vodka, and she despaired. I wrote a review for Will Godfrey about the Tsarina. And Russians don't have a temperance mentality. They have a different way of viewing alcohol. In some places, intoxication is a fundamental part of experience. And the way we define it, we claim addiction is a disease, and then we go, what the hell's the matter with those people? For example, they did a cross-national study in Greece, and they couldn't make Greek people understand withdrawal. They couldn't get the concept across to them. And we say, what the hell's the matter with these people, these ignoramuses? And we don't realize that we have a point of view that we're imposing worldwide with results that haven't been good worldwide as bad as they've been here.
A nice segue into the next question, which actually I think we covered in the interview, but maybe people watching this won't have seen that. Jamie wants to know the concept of chemical dependence. Oh, she's curious about the concept of chemical dependence and LPP's take on that. Why do heroin and alcohol users sometimes need medication-assisted treatments, medication-assisted therapies to safely detox? And she wrote, I think. And it seems LPP doesn't believe in chemical dependency. Maybe I have that wrong, though. Please discuss.
Well, there's a term that never comes from my lips, which is physical dependence. Like there's physical dependence and there's psychological dependence. They're two totally different things. And first of all, DSM-5 and American Pharmacology have thrown that out the window. And I wrote a book called The Meaning of Addiction, where I pointed out when they originally created concept of physical dependence, they said there were only two things that fell in that category, narcotics, opioids, and alcohol. But they changed that. And they changed it because, well, physical dependence doesn't have a well-defined meaning. When people get used to being intoxicated with marijuana, is that physical dependence or is that psychological dependence? I tell the story, I'm writing my memoir, and I went to the animal laboratories at the University of Michigan. Somehow I got myself admitted there when I was 22 years old with Archie. And we went in, James Wood, the lab was run by a man who went on to become the head of the NIDA, Charles Schuster, who was a big booster of mine. He's dead. James Woods ran the laboratory. And he said, well, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I have some different ideas about addiction. And I began to talk a little bit. And they said, well, marijuana isn't addictive because it doesn't cause withdrawal and tolerance. And I said, I know people who've learned to drive when they were intoxicated on marijuana and they couldn't originally. Is that like tolerance? And he said, well, call that tolerance. And I said, when people break up in a relationship, in love relationships, some people can't sleep for nights at a time. Some people kill themselves. Is that you? Couldn't that be called withdrawal? And he said, well, you could call that withdrawal. And he smiled because those guys, experimental guys, are more open-minded than disease guys. And so the ironclad concepts that define physical dependence aren't ironclad. They can't be separated from psychological. You can't say, well, why does a person lose all bearing when they break up in a love relationship? Why do they kill the person that they said they loved? Why do they commit suicide? That's an awful strong reaction. It's almost physical. Is that physical dependence? It's a dichotomy. Somebody accused us of seeing a dichotomy between physical and psychological when we're talking about applying LPP. We're doing the reverse. We're saying you can't separate any element of addiction, one from the other. What can be called physical and what can be called psychological there's no such distinction, can't be differentiated. Do you have any reaction to that, Zach?
I think you pretty much summed it up. It's where does one end, where does the other begin? If you really, that becomes a complicated question upon really minimal inspection.
And no human being can perform that analysis. And that's what Buddhism and a million other mind thought things are about. They say, well, if you think things through, you have a totally different reaction to them throughout your body and the universe.
So the other one is in line with that. There are two more questions. So let me know what your threshold is, but I bet you'll be able to answer both of these kind of quickly. I don't know. This is from Mary. While I generally understand and agree with the concept that addiction is not a disease, definitely not an incurable disease or lifelong condition, and the substances are not addicting, quotes, I do question whether opioid use disorder is somewhat unique and might require a more lifelong medication-based treatment approach. I'm just looking at this article, which states studies have shown that fewer than 10% of persons with opioid addiction are able to achieve long-term abstinence without medication-assisted treatment with methadone or buprenorphine maintenance. No behavioral cognitive treatments alone have been shown to be effective for patients with opioid addiction or severe OUD. And research over the past 50 years shows that the most critical need in the treatment of opioid addiction is the continued and expanded availability of treatment with long-acting, steady-state medication. Research has documented that a relative endorphin deficiency. I'm just laughing because I know where to go with this.
Here now?
Yeah. But basically, just to make this, most of that was her quoting an article and wondering, how do you guys address this?
Well, let's start it. People outgrow narcotics all the time. The most famous the original study on maturing out was 1963 by Charles Winnick. It's how I got into the addiction field, where he pointed out from 2/3 to 3/4 of the known inner city heroin addicts in New York ceased to be heroin addicts over a period of 10 to 12 years from their early 20s to their early 30s. The original outgrowing addiction comes from narcotics. I talked about temperance, but we made narcotics in the form of heroin the sine qua non of addiction. And everything that she said is wrong. Most people change and shift their narcotics patterns. Most people outgrow it. Even inner city addicts outgrow it. But of course, people with more to lose, like physicians, regularly quit narcotic addictions. And we know that. And how do we know that? Everybody's taken an opioid. One of my best routines, of course, is to go into a room where everybody's been taught that if you take narcotics, you're inevitably addicted to them. And I say, oh, how many people here have taken an opioid painkiller? And everybody in the room raises their hand. And then I say, how many became addicted? And nobody raises their hand. I say, well, maybe that's too difficult of a question. Did any of you really feel an appeal of the drug and feel like I'd like to take more? And then people raise their hand and I say, did you keep taking it? And they said, well, no. I had to go to work. I have a family, for God's sake. I have children. I have a husband or a wife. I wasn't going to do that. And where was I going to get them? Go out and score it on the street anyhow? Everybody's had a personal experience with the drug that is supposed to be inevitably addictive, and it's not. And then that goes back to, while I was writing Love and Addiction, the Vietnam experience was occurring. There was massive addiction to pure opioids. And when they came back to the United States, over 90% of the men kicked. If you read Love and Addiction, we quote Richard Wilbur, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Medicine and Environment. And he said, everything I learned in medical school about narcotic addiction was proven wrong to me by the Vietnam experience. And this woman, who's sympathetic towards us, is recreating everything that he learned that was wrong in medical school, which is still taught in medical school. It's an example of how we can never overcome. It's more than ignorance. It's a theory. It's a philosophy. It's part of how our mental baggage as Americans and about addiction that has to be broken down. Even people quite close to me say, well, yes, but if you take heroin, you have to become addicted. So she's wrong that people don't get over it. We've known about that from Vietnam. We've known about that from Charles Winnick. Of course, Rat Park shows that animals addicted to morphine solution cease to be addicted when they're put in Rat Park, when they can screw around with other rats and run around the Ferris wheel and have a lot of space. It's that idea is continuing to be sold as we began this our talk about MAT on, by people who say, well, you have to keep taking methadone and buprenorphine forever, which isn't going to happen for most people. And then what happens? And our good colleague, I wish he was here, Aaron Ferguson, says, remarkably large percentage of people on MAT wean themselves from it. They know themselves that they're capable of overcoming the drug, and they do so on their own. So our good friend, Mary, thanks for being on our team. There's a basic block in your thinking. I don't fault you for having it. It's fundamental. It's wrong. It's actually been done away with in many cases. There's no separate category for addiction and opioids in DSM-5. They don't say, oh, addiction, opioids, never get over it, people never change. That's not in there. They have a criteria of, do you cease having problems no matter what drug you're using?
Yeah.
And, you know, my quiz question is, DSM-5 applies the word addiction to one thing in the whole universe. And then I say to people, what's that thing? And they guessed sex or video games, but for some reason DSM-5 decided those weren't addictive. The one thing that DSM-5 calls addictive is gambling. Mm. And it's sort of the sine qua non, that has to be the reductio ad absurdum of insanity. There's one thing in the universe that's addictive, and it's not what used to be addictive, narcotics, and it's not what a lot of people think of as addictive, like that are narcotics, like sex and gaming, which the International Classification of Diseases calls addictive. It's gambling. Huh, who would have guessed? Shows how arbitrary that whole operation is.
And there's another aspect I'll just tackle real quick that, you know, most of that was a quote. So Mary's saying the fundamental question is, everything you're saying makes sense. Why is it that I'm reading this thing that seems also to make sense that's saying all this stuff about opioids? And
well, I hope
everything
she gets into her classroom, she argues vociferously against it.
So one of the assumptions made there too, in addition to everything you said, even in the literature itself, whatever obstacles they're going through to make opioids the more addictive thing, or opioids addictive where other things aren't, they mentioned that what does it say? I mentioned that some percentage of people aren't able to abstain from one thing or another, and so of course there's a sampling bias there. They're probably looking at a certain group of people for a certain amount of time and there's also the target is abstinence, and that, as you and I mentioned, is that can't just be the goal. I mean, maybe you want people to kick a certain type of drug, maybe you don't. What do they want? And I think that's what's missing from just about every piece of literature that we have on drugs and addiction and programs to address it.
And what we want people to lead a full life. And the argument she's making or she's describing, and for MAT as well, at least if you take methadone, you can lead a full life, which that's not 100% true. You know, you're going to have to go get your methadone. You're going to have to apply for it. You're going to have to get it somewhere. You're going to have some severe restrictions on your life. And, you know, that's for you to decide whether that's your best way to go. And LPP and with Aaron Ferguson, we leave that decision to the persons. We tell them that people can kick. They do all the time. Whether you choose to, whether you want to, we'll leave you to decide that. But it's not the case that any group of people is unable to abstain from any drug as the course of their life changes. And people themselves are stunned to learn. And of course, the best example of that is smoking, where people feel they can't exist without it. And then they kick.
So his last question's from a man named Jordan. I assume it's a man. I don't know why. A person named Jordan who says, how do you make the case for drug reform to those who are still addicted? And how do you convince someone with an addiction that the drug isn't the sole root of and cause of their problems? And he puts in parentheses, same question in a sense, I suppose. I'm always trying to explain that to people, as you put it, that there's rarely such a thing as problematic. I'm butchering you, Jordan. I'm sorry. I'm always trying to explain to people, as you put it, that there's rarely such a thing as a problematic drug, only problems that people have who take them. It's an absolute nightmare.
Well, is it Jordan?
Yeah. Yeah.
I love Jordan. He's getting on our point of view and saying, well, how do we spread this out there?
Right.
But he's making a point. One of Ethan Nadelman's great projects was to get 12-step people on board with drug policy reform. And really, that never happened. But what's really going on, what would you say about those people? There are people who say, well, I couldn't quit smoking, so it can't be done. Or I only could quit smoking with Nicorettes or with hypnotism. They're projecting, they're generalizing their experience to the universe.
Yeah.
That's called a fatal vision. It's a psychology. It's a problem of reference, where you feel, well, what's happening to me is true for every human being.
Copernican problem or something like that. Yeah.
Right. It's common among human beings, and Americans more than average. Just because you're experiencing something one way doesn't mean that's how everybody is experiencing it or will experience it, or even you will experience it. And so I used to write for something called rehabs.com. And the last column I wrote for them, you read about it in my memoir, I got booted out of more places than just about anybody, was in order to be a counselor in the 21st century, you cannot be wedded to one theory, and particularly the 12-step theory, that you have other people have a disease and must abstain because you feel that was true of your own experience.
Right.
So I guess if he's asking for a practical question, you know, it's hard to reason with people. Like, for example, going into a room and I say, how many people, what's the toughest addiction to quit? And they all shout out smoking. And I say, well, how many people here quit smoking? You know, and 2/3 of them raise their hand. I say, oh, did you join a support group or did you use Nicorettes to quit? And a couple of people raised their hands and said they did. They deny their own experience in talking about that, but you can try that. You can say to the person, oh, do you know anybody who's quit an addiction, or have you ever quit an addiction on your own? Did you ever smoke, or did you know anybody who smoked? And then, of course, you can't win that argument. They'll start arguing with you and say, well, smoking, I know I said it was a tough addiction, but it's not really like heroin or alcohol. And then you can say, why isn't it? But the point that you want to get them to see is that what they're doing is violating the spirit of free will and respect for others. And what they need to do is to step back and say, okay, this is my experience. This is the way I've chosen to do it. It's arbitrary, but it's not arbitrary for me. And you say, God bless you. It's a free country. Do what you want. Go to church, go to an AA meeting. But that's just not what everybody prefers to do. And here's one exercise I do. This is actually the first night. After I wrote Love and Addiction, I didn't really have any place to go, but out of the blue, I got invited to speak at the national conference of the Addiction Research Foundation, which is now called CAMH, which is the biggest organization, dealing with practical aspects of addiction in the world. And I gave the keynote address, and then they had a reporter come up and comment, and he was an AA guy. And, he said, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." And then this is what I said to him. I say, "You were in AA. How many people of what degree of alcoholics would you say, what percentage of alcoholics entered AA?" And there's an actual answer to that question. It's about 10% will actually go to AA. And he gave some estimate. He said, "Well, maybe I know 20%. I say, "Good enough." I'd say it's 10%. And then of all the people that you ever were in AA with, what percentage would you say stuck it out and really made it work? And then his answer is going to be like 10%. So I say, well, okay, if we take 10% of 10% or 10% of 20%, that's 1% and 2%. So you are now proposing to the national meeting of the Addiction Research Foundation an approach that you yourself say successfully works for 1 or 2% of the entire population. What do you think should happen to the other 98%? Should we just say, well, screw you, you're going to die? That's what you believe, isn't it? Should we say, well, can we work with this group of people who has a different way of thinking in a way that's helpful to them? And that's going to circle back into what you and I describe as harm reduction. What's the best way to work with a human being, which we do in Life Process Program, to get them to come to grips in the best way with their life, using one substance or another, or any combination of substances, or not using them? That's the issue to be thought through. And we help people to think through it.